Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we are continuing our ongoing coverage with the Russia-Ukrainian war. I've started out today's map going back to January 1st. I thought it important to show you, the viewer, the kind of pressure that Ukrainian forces are currently under, especially in the area near Bakhmut and Soledar. The Russians have been continuing withering assaults, running from Soledar down to Bakhmut, ultimately with the goal of seizing control of Bakhmut. Now, first, what I want to do is forward from January 1st to present day, where you, the viewer, can kind of see what is happening on the ground and what the Russians are exactly trying to do at this point. So this is Bakhmut. To the north of Bakhmut is Soledar. And we're going to scroll out just a little bit and we'll start the advancing process. So you can see the Russians relentlessly moving forward. Have the Russians taken casualties? Yes, absolutely. Have the Ukrainians taken casualties? Yes, absolutely. But it appears, at least within the area near Soledar, the Russians have seized control of the town. And then to the south, the Russians appear to be looking to envelop Bakhmut from the south, and then again possibly from the north as well. We're seeing very heavy fighting on the eastern outskirts and inside of Soledar itself. The front lines, the Ukrainian frontal defensive positions near Bakhmut, have been broken by Russian forces. The Ukrainians have fallen back to secondary positions towards the center of the city. And again, these gray areas are contested areas, in all likelihood controlled by Russian forces. To the south, again, you have this the salient that has now been formed, with the Russians now operating well to the southwest of Bakhmut. Again, let's focus on this area southwest of Bakhmut and look at what happened. So again, this area here, so Bakhmut is becoming very precarious for Ukrainian forces at this point. We have information that the United States, generals in the United States, would like to see the Ukrainians pull out of Bakhmut, drop back to secondary lines just to the east of Kramatorsk, probably halfway between Bakhmut, Soledar, and Kramatorsk, quite possibly in this area here. The rationale behind that, in all likelihood, would then to pummel Russian forces with long-range rocket systems, HIMARS, Excalibur 155mm precision-guided artillery rounds against targets in and around Bakhmut. The Ukrainians, on their part, are insisting that they want to hold on or attempt to hold on to Bakhmut, but it's becoming very, very apparent right now that the resources and efforts by Russian forces to seek control of Bakhmut are outpacing the ability of Ukrainian forces to defend it. So in all likelihood, we will probably see at some point the Ukrainians pull out, and like Soledar, the Russians move in to Bakhmut. Now, we keep hearing about the prospects of a spring offensive, a early summer offensive, again by the Russians. I contend that it will be a late summer offensive operation by the Russians. Again, the ground continues to be very saturated with water, very muddy, a very difficult environment to operate large mechanized formations in the springtime in eastern Ukraine. Compounding that, the Russian mobilization efforts. It seems more realistic that Russian mobilization efforts will be more successful, they will be more prepared around late summer rather than early to mid-spring. So again, late summer, late August, early September, I believe we'll probably see renewed Russian offensive operations against a variety of targets along the front lines. Quite possibly not just in the direction of Bakhmut, in the direction of Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Lyman. Again, higher probability offensive operations by the Russians near Zaporizhia, and quite possibly operations coming out of areas near Belgorod as well. At this point, from the Russian point of view, there are really two options. The Russians can declare that they have denazified Ukraine, in their words, not ours, and pull back, essentially announcing victory, but at the same time, it would be a defeat for Russia. That is very unlikely. The second option is the continuation of war. We are seeing Russian society gearing up for a long, protracted conflict. We are seeing the Russian industrial machine gearing up for a long, protracted conflict. Right now, the front lines are relatively static. Neither side, outside of the Ukrainian offensive that took place near Kharkov and the Russian pullout of Kherson, neither side has really made any major gains outside of recent gains by Russian forces near Soledar and Bakhmut. Now, there is a lot of pressure on Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians are taking heavy losses. Now, this is not being widely publicized by the Ukrainians, by the West, for propaganda reasons. But nonetheless, this war is taking a heavy toll on the Ukrainian military. And as I've talked about before, we could reach a point where, under continued pressure by Russian forces, and right now this is a pressure game by the Russian military, you could see the Ukrainian military start to fall apart in certain areas of the conflict zone. Compounding that, compounding the continued mobilization efforts by Russian forces, the continued buildup, the continued expansion of Russian forces, you could see at that point a breakout in major advances by the Russian military. You could see at some point such a collapse in the Ukrainian front lines as the Russians again threaten to push the Ukrainians to the Dnieper River. Now, look, that's not going to happen now. Again, this is post-late summer. This is going into the winter of 2023 and 2024. And this is where we talk about history. And it's important to understand and remember history. In 1941, for that entire year, it looked very much like the Germans were going to defeat the Soviets. In 1942, it still appeared that it was highly likely that the Germans were going to defeat the Russians, the Soviets. It really wasn't until 1943-44 that things changed. And if you look at this conflict, obviously the Russian military has not sustained the types of losses that the Soviet military sustained in 1941. So what we're seeing here could be reminiscent of what we observed during the war against Nazi Germany. The prospects that the Russian military is going to start to improve, start to increase in size, is highly likely. So I think at this point, the Ukrainians are seeing this, and that's why we're seeing again the request for additional armaments. Obviously, the tank issue right now, the M1 Abrams, the Leopard 2, the Challenger is kind of at the forefront. But again, the size and scope of that infusion of equipment is not going to change the dynamics on the ground right now. The Ukrainians are going to need a lot more than 2 battalion sets of Western tanks for it to really make a difference. It just isn't. Especially not just now, but again, future facing. 1 year from now. Because right now it looks like the Russians are gearing up for a very long, protracted war where they now understand that they are going to have to go through a reconstruction, a reformation, and a build-up process before they can start launching renewed large-scale offensive operations. Because again, the only alternative for the Russians other than that is to declare that they've already defeated the Ukrainians and pull out, which again essentially would be a defeat. Now, could that happen? It could, but unlikely. So we'll continue to monitor. We will continue to report. Thank you for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.